Good afternoon. I'm Nancy Nunn. I'm the Assistant Director of the Hughes Center for Agro-Ecology, and we appreciate all of you joining us for this webinar. As I just said to Dr. Hauser, he has a lot of competition with the beautiful weather outside today. So we're really happy to have so many of you join us. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started with the introduction. If we are going to record this meeting, and we will post the presentation later on our website, the Hughes Center's website. We'd ask everybody to mute themselves. It's really easy to forget that, and we hear people's lunch orders and everything else. So if you could do that, we'd really appreciate it. And we will have a time at the end of this for question and answer period. So we'd ask that you post any questions that you have in the chat, and we'll go through them, as many of them as we can, and we will provide answers afterwards too for those that we're not able to get to. So with that said, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Matt Hauser. And Dr. Hauser is with the Nature Conservancy. He's their senior social scientist for the Chesapeake Bay Agriculture Program. He's also an assistant research professor at the University of Maryland's, or UMSI's, as we all know it, at Horn Point. And his research is very interesting because he examines the cross-scale factors that shape farmers' recognition and their response to environmental change. And he's really been looking at the barriers to more efficient nutrient management. With that said, Matt, I'm going to let you take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Nancy. And thank you to everyone who's given up a lovely afternoon, or at least part of it, to watch this talk. So I get my screen sharing going here. Great. Give me 1 minute here. Excellent. How's this looking to everyone? Okay.
Looks good.
Thank you. love the input. Thank you, everyone. Okay. So I want to start off, by giving maybe a little bit of my philosophy, if you will, here on farming. I doubt many people in this group need this reminder, but I always found it kind of nice to begin with this just in case. And it's this picture of, what I think of as almost like a stereotypical image of a farmer. Kind of lone individuals standing over the land they manage, complete autonomy and agency is kind of implied here of how the decisions are made on this farm. And I think that's like really the way that the popular media depicts farmers. It's the way a lot of kind of like traditional consumers and non-farming people view it. A lot of academics that aren't involved in farming think of farmers as these kind of like completely autonomous individuals. Well, I'm a sociologist, right? And I'm, really focused on how contextual factors shape the decisions and choices and behaviors that individuals take. And so what I would emphasize here is, farmers are certainly individualistic. They are certainly independent, but context matters, right? They are not completely autonomous in their decisions. And in fact, really kind of highly influenced by factors outside of their control, markets, policy, different pieces of information and knowledge, and of course, weather. And I just want to emphasize that really the focus of my research that I've been doing for the last, 10 or 12 years now has been on thinking about how those contextual factors shape and often constrain the decisions that farmers make. So I want to take you on a specific journey, if you will, into that work, focused on a central question, which is how are commercial grain farmers responding to climate change impacts, right? And again, what I hope you see here is my focus on how those contextual factors shape that decision-making process that farmers take in response to climate change impacts. I'm going to talk about this across 2 different studies in 2 different agricultural geographies, maybe the key agricultural geographies for grain production in the US. The Midwestern Corn Belt, will be the first area that I take you into, and that's where a lot of my initial dissertation research and then my time at Indiana University was spent focusing on corn belt row crop farmers. And then I'll take you into a more recent study that was funded by the Hughes Center, where we examined farmer responses to climate impacts in Maryland. And I'll end this talk by just sort of, quickly going over some of the current work that I've been doing with the Nature Conservancy and UNCES, where we're really trying to test behavior change interventions. So let's jump into the Midwest study, the land of corn and casseroles. I want to give a little bit of background here. This is going to be important for both this study and for a lot of the work I talk about in the future of this talk. A major focus of this work is nitrogen fertilizer. Frankly, this has been one of the major focuses of my entire career. It's just a particularly important input, this synthetically produced nitrogen fertilizer that it's been called the cornerstone input of the industrial agriculture system, if you will, or row crop agriculture system. The capacity to use the Haber-Bosch process and essentially pull nitrogen out of the air in plants that look like this has generated almost limitless supplies of nitrogen inputs that's enabled our current agro-food system to evolve to be what it is today. And there's some estimates that suggest yields that have been generated from the use of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer support about 40% of the global population, right? So this is part of the major transition that we've seen during the Green Revolution over the last, 60, 80 years. And I'll note, just a fun little statistic that I always think about with nitrogen. Some studies actually estimate that 80% of the nitrogen that is actually part of the amino acids that builds the protein in your body. So 80% of that is from ultimately synthetic nitrogen, coming out of one of these factories. So this is really important, right? Global input into our agro-food system, but also I think very personally important to all of us because it is part of all of us. But for farmers, it has a particular importance, right? Nitrogen just generally is typically the most limiting factor in terms of any plant growth, including corn in grain systems. So for farmers, nitrogen is a really important piece of their input, a really important management decision. It's something that often costs farmers a lot in terms of total input costs, but too little application can stunt yields and have dramatic impact on profitability in grain systems. So for farmers, nitrogen is really about effective crop growth and ultimately livelihood. So it's a really important management decision in these large grain systems. So there's lots of good things about synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, but it's also the source of some of the most widely recognized environmental problems today. It has numerous consequences. If it gets into drinking water, such as wells and agricultural areas, it can contribute to degraded human health, particularly in young children, blue baby syndrome, as some of you may know. It's a contributor to hypoxic zones and frankly, degraded water quality across the world. In the Gulf, it's responsible for about 75% of the dead zone in the Gulf, agricultural nitrogen loss. In the Chesapeake Bay, as many of you are familiar, agricultural nitrogen loss is generally considered the major contributing factor to the eutrophic zone here. It's also a source of climate change emissions. Producing synthetic nitrogen fertilizer in the Haber-Bosch process is traditionally fairly intense in terms of emissions. We use natural gas, but actually on-farm management of nitrogen has climate change implications as well. Putting nitrogen out on the field produces nitrous oxide emissions, which is a greenhouse gas that's about 300 times more powerful at heating the Earth's atmosphere compared to carbon dioxide on a per molecule basis. So a pretty important source of agricultural emissions here. So turning to the Midwest and nitrogen management specifically here, really if you want to think about nitrogen management, the Midwest is one of the key global areas, particularly the Corn Belt. And part of that is because we're applying a lot of nitrogen into the Corn Belt. So this is a map from the USDA. Essentially, the more orange the counties are that you're seeing there, the more nitrogen that's being applied. And you can see we're up in the 45, 65 range of kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. So lots of nitrogen going out into the agricultural system here in the Midwest. But where there's smoke, there's fire, or better said here, where there's fire, there's smoke. Large amounts of nitrogen inputs contribute to large amounts of nitrogen pollution. I already mentioned the amount coming out of the hypoxic or coming into the hypoxic zone, but similarly, nitrous oxide emissions are the single most important greenhouse gas in the Midwest because of the amount of nitrogen fertilizer being put on there. And you can see those emission factors here, again, at the per county level in tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So in the Midwest, in terms of climate change, is already experiencing dramatic shifts, particularly whenever it comes to heavy rain events. So from 1958 to 2012, the upper Midwest, this area that I kind of have pictured, essentially, Ohio over to Iowa, has experienced about a 37% increase in the amount of precipitation falling during heavy rains. Essentially what it means is you're more likely to get a heavy rain event. They're happening more frequently. And whenever they do happen, you're getting a lot more rainfall in those events. And this has some pretty significant consequences whenever we think about nitrogen management. Nitrogen fertilizer is not the most stable of all inputs. It's very susceptible to loss from excess water. It can run off the fields or go relatively deeply into groundwater. And so we know that these increases in heavy rain events that have already happened and are expected to continue to happen are likely to accelerate nitrogen fertilizer losses, both in terms of nitrous oxide and in terms of loss to the bay, or excuse me, in this case, the Gulf. Some estimates are putting this increase due to heavy rain events and precipitation changes overall in the Midwest is potentially increasing loss by around 30%. So pretty significant there towards the end of the century. But again, given the importance of fertilizer for crop management, this loss of nitrogen off of agricultural fields is not just an environmental problem. It's ultimately something that challenges farmers' profitability, farmers' ability to make a living. And you can see here a nice picture of, over on the right, corn that's receiving adequate amounts of nitrogen, and on the left, corn that's nitrogen deficient. It's stunted, it's challenged growing, right? And whenever we see this transition, right, it's certainly something that farmers need to be thinking about. Nitrogen loss has pretty significant economic consequences for them as well. So going into this study a little bit more specifically, I think the scenario where we're seeing heavy rains already increasing, we're seeing greater loss to the environment, and we're seeing these economic threats that farmers are facing. It sets up this really interesting scenario where, farmers ultimately need to respond using some type of adaptation practice. So I'm going to define adaptation practice here as on-farm practices that reduce vulnerability to climate change and climatic events. And for the purposes of this study, I had this idea that we could maybe kind of roughly create two categories of adaptation practices. I'm not going to claim that this is some perfect dichotomy, but for the purposes of understanding potential methods, this is really what I tried to argue. That one type of adaptation or group of adaptation practices we could call conservation adaptation practices. So these are practices that reduce vulnerability, the economic vulnerability to climate change that farmers face, while also minimizing environmental impacts, reducing the amount of fertilizer loss or the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. So what types of practices are these? These could be things like doing a better job of cover cropping, using inputs like nitrogen stabilizers that would keep nitrogen in the ground a little bit more effectively, less susceptible to loss, or using a number of the best management practices like the 4 R's, applying nitrogen in the right place at the right time, using, for instance, side dress or getting it underneath the soil. All of these things are known to reduce the potential that nitrogen is lost from agricultural fields, and they ultimately can enable farmers to be more efficient and thus be more profitable while also losing less fertilizer. There is an alternative, right, to conservation adaptation. I'm not claiming this is the best name, but what I've called them is quick fix adaptation practices. This is something that's certainly not limited just to agriculture. I think we all do this. But the idea behind quick fix adaptation are these are adaptation practices that you can use that reduce vulnerability, economic vulnerability in particular, to climatic events, but maintain or increase environmental degradation, right? And in the case of grain farming and nitrogen management, kind of the main practice in this category that comes to mind is ultimately increasing nitrogen fertilizer application rates. This has been called in the past literature insurance application of nitrogen. So you apply a little bit or a lot of extra nitrogen before or during the growing season to ensure that if you lose some nitrogen, it won't affect crop loss because you'll have a little bit left over ultimately to make sure you're having that maximum yield and profitability. The consequence, or I should say, the reason this works is that nitrogen is cheap relative to corn. It's typically at a 0.1 ratio, meaning that 10 pounds of nitrogen costs what about 1 bushel of corn typically is. That's not always the case, but on a historical average, that's about what we're at. So you can waste some nitrogen, and if it leads to yield, it becomes economically profitability. But the consequences are that nitrogen inputs into agricultural systems are positively correlated with nitrogen losses. So what do we see? Generally, the more nitrogen rate or the higher your nitrogen rate is at both at scale, so at a regional level, but also on farm level, the higher amount of nitrogen loss you're going to have, either in terms of loss to waterways, or this graph shows actually an exponential relationship between nitrogen rate and nitrous oxide emissions. So the higher your rate is, your nitrous oxide emissions out of agriculture increase rather dramatically. So I had done some work before this study, so I had a couple of kind of, knowledge points going in, if you will. One was that Midwest farmers, already felt like they were experiencing these climate change impacts, that the literature, the empirical work has already suggested are happening. 41% feel they directly experienced climate change, and in particular, heavy rain events were the most noted environmental impact. And 92% of Midwest farmers in studies that I've done show that they believe climate change is happening. That certainly doesn't mean that they believe anthropogenic climate change is happening, but in general, farmers often see the climatic shifts in weather over the course of their history. And even if they are skeptical about humans' causal role in climate change, some other work that I've done is suggest that farmers strongly support adaptation efforts, because ultimately this is about responding to and potentially preparing for these extreme events. So, what this all said to me is that farmers are very likely adapting to climate change. But the real question was, how are they adapting to climate change, and in particular, these heavy rain events? And I felt like this was an important question to ask about these ongoing climate impacts, because we know that current behavior in agricultural systems often predicts future behavior. So knowing how farmers are adapting now is suggestive of at least how they may be adapting into the future unless conditions change dramatically. The other thing we know is that economic pressures, returning to those contexts that I talked about at the beginning, those economic pressures can limit farmers' use of conservation practices. And I was wondering if we would see these pressures ultimately motivate farmers to prioritize and use quick fix adaptation practices. So we asked those questions as part of a larger NSF Coupled Natural and Human Systems project that ran from 2014 to 2017. And I'm going to pull one of the kind of big data collection points we had in that. I'm going to look at interviews that we did with 154 corn and soy farmers from Iowa, Indiana, and Michigan. The interviews are essentially split across those, around 50 in each state. And the average farm size of the interviewees was about 1,600 acres. So, essentially a pretty good representation of big scale grain agriculture in the Midwest. So let's jump on the results here. How did farmers actually adapt? What did they tell us that they were doing? Well, 58 of that 154 farmers described perceiving nitrogen loss from heavy rain events. And of the 58, 44 reported adaptation of some type in the past. 12 of the 44 reported using exclusively conservation adaptation practices, so increasing cover crops, using nitrogen stabilizers or side dress. But the majority of the farmers who reported adaptation, 32 actually reported increasing their nitrogen application rates in some way or another. Sometimes this was done, before the season in anticipation of heavy rain events. They would say they would add a little bit more to be prepared. Other farmers did this, retroactively after a heavy rain event. They would come back in with side dressing equipment and apply more nitrogen than they would otherwise, sort of guesstimating, if you will, the amount of loss they had had with spring rains. And just to illustrate this quickly, here's a nice little quote from one of the farmers that we interviewed. The amount of rain we've had recently has made us add an additional 50 pounds per acre of nitrogen at side dress, just because the rain flushes it down the system. So many farmers told us things like this. This farmer coming back in at side dress to reapply nitrogen. And I'll just note, for those that may be unfamiliar, an additional 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre is pretty significant, even in these fairly high yielding systems like in the Midwest. You're talking maybe an average of 200 to 250 pounds of nitrogen applied per acre generally. So an additional 50 pounds is a pretty significant increase. Not every farmer was doing this amount, but we did get a number of reports that were suggesting fairly high amounts of nitrogen going back into the system. Okay, so we see that, these quick fix responses, at least among adapting farmers, was the prevalent response in the Midwest. Did economic pressures influence these decisions? Well, farmers that we interviewed described facing significant pressure to ensure maximum profitability on an annual basis, right? They had debt. They needed to service that debt. It's a very competitive system. Farmers are competing for land, and they really felt like, we need to be doing this if we want to stay in business and not have a more successful farmer, ultimately kind of take over our operation. Now, farmers consistently said they had actually tried the conservation strategies that I'd mentioned before to try to reduce nitrogen loss and maintain yield in the face of heavier rain. Things like cover crops, stabilizers, and applying multiple times throughout the growing season without increasing nitrogen rates. The challenge was that these were essentially seen as either ineffective and or too expensive relative to nitrogen inputs. For instance, stabilizers would cost $10 to $15 per acre to apply, and you could, add quite a bit of additional nitrogen for less than that. And so farmers felt like, well, I'm not sure if the stabilizer will work, but I'm confident that the additional nitrogen will help me get through these rain events and will be relatively affordable to do that. So farmers often made decisions like this, ultimately needing to prioritize that profitability. And I want to emphasize this wasn't necessarily something farmers were excited about, right? They saw higher nitrogen rates as necessary to ensure nitrogen loss did not limit production and profitabilities. And they used more nitrogen even if they were concerned about the environmental impacts, right? Farmers often express strong stewardship values. They care about the wider environment. But given the priorities of running a business in a competitive and difficult system, they often have to prioritize that profitability production component. And you can see farmers in these interviews very strongly be frustrated that they feel compelled ultimately to use higher nitrogen rates. One farmer, I think, puts it very well. I think most farmers are thinking more about the environment. Most people are trying not to throw on a little extra nitrogen just so we don't run out. And so that's what makes it more difficult. If the weather changes, you have to add more nitrogen than you plan, right? Really illustrating that we don't want to do this, but this seems at the very least like a necessary part of business. Okay, so let me wrap this up here. Increased nitrogen rates in the Midwest were the dominant adaptive approach that we saw among adapting farmers. And given the relationship between nitrogen rates and environmental impact, this response potentially increases nitrogen losses to the environment. Why did farmers do this? Well, more nitrogen was seen as the most effective way to overcome climate change given economic pressures. Now, I want to just pause for a moment and illustrate something quickly that was important and stood out in that study before I transition here. And that's this focus on in-season, split nitrogen, side dress application, whatever you want to call it. It's essentially putting fertilizer on multiple times throughout the growing season. The general approach to this, this is a conservation practice. I want to emphasize it's something that we push here in the Chesapeake Bay. It's pushed in the Midwest. It's encouraged as a way where you apply a greater number of times throughout the growing season. You increase efficiency. Corn does a better job of getting that nitrogen. So you can lower your nitrogen application rates while increasing yield, becoming more efficient, and ultimately reducing your environmental harm, right? That's the way this practice is thought to be able to work. But what we saw in this study of farmer adaptation decisions was the opposite, right? Farmers were going in with side dress after rain events and ultimately using that as a way to increase their nitrogen application rate. And one of the things that I did after this work was actually question, is this a wider phenomenon? Are we seeing farmers implement these conservation practices in ways that don't necessarily lead to the conservation benefits that we're expecting? And so we did a survey of about 2,600 farmers across the Midwest. And we found that this was, using a fairly sophisticated statistical model, a common practice that in general farmers were using at least multiple in-season applications as a way to increase nitrogen application rates rather than reduce them. And I just want to make this point because it'll become important a little later in this discussion that conservation practices in a system that prioritizes and often demands focusing on profitability and production, conservation practices often aren't implemented to reduce environmental harms. They're implemented in a very rational way. They're implemented in a way to prioritize production because that's what's needed in this system. It's not that farmers are bad people or anything like that. It's that they're responding to these external challenges. But the key thing here is, right, we cannot assume from our end that conservation practices are operating exactly how we think they are because that context shapes the way in which they're implemented. I'll touch on that a little bit later, but I want to make that point that came out of this work. Okay, so I'm having, these fairly depressing thoughts, I guess, in the Midwest. COVID hits, and I see a really awesome, exciting job opportunity between the Nature Conservancy and the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. And so, I and my family move across the country here. We land on the eastern shore of Maryland, and a few things start to strike me living here in Maryland. One was that Maryland's facing many of the same climate challenges as the Midwest, right? We've seen a dramatic increase over that same timeline of heavy rainfall, about 78% increase actually compared to the Midwest, 37%. We're getting more flooding across Maryland and the mid-Atlantic region, greater amounts of saltwater intrusion, agricultural droughts, and on overall agricultural production is becoming a little bit more sporadic, more difficult, and likely already impacting farmers' decision making. Now, I know a lot of this research is scaled up to that mid-Atlantic region. I know the Hughes Center is working on downscaling some of this work to Maryland specific. I think that's going to be really important, but we certainly do have a pretty good general sense that these trends are happening and have already happened and will continue to happen given climate change in Maryland moving forward. And just like the Midwest, these impacts, particularly heavy rain, are increasing nitrogen loss off of our agricultural systems. There's been some really interesting modeling that suggests, for instance, that by around 2070, we'll see about a 28% increase in nitrogen loads going into the bay from agricultural loss alone. And this assumes essentially the status quo of behavior. So this is something, again, that's challenging farmers from an economic perspective. Conditions are becoming more difficult. No one wants to see nitrogen running off the water, but also from an environmental perspective, climate change in the bay is putting us on a treadmill in terms of meeting our water quality goals, where if we stand still, it'll take us backwards in terms of really kind of making that difference. But one of the things that's different, there's a lot of the same happening here between Maryland and the Midwest. But one of the things that's different is so the regulatory or the policy context. The Midwest, you'll forgive the good and the bad, the ugly picture here. My point is the Midwest is kind of like the Wild West. It's fairly unregulated. There's not a lot of mandatory policy that farmers are facing. There's certainly some threats of that happening, and there's some pushes, but compared to the East Coast and Maryland in particular, the Midwest is fairly unregulated whenever it comes to farmers management and particularly their nitrogen management. Maryland, I somewhat joke about this, but I often see Maryland a bit like the Europe of the US. It's a lot more regulated than other areas in terms of agriculture and particularly fertilizer management. And in particular, we have regulatory nutrient management, where for the purposes of what I'm going to be talking about, essentially put a limit based on yield expectations on how much farmers can apply in terms of their fertilizer management. And so we see this really interesting policy difference across these regions. And I got curious. Whenever I came here, how are Maryland grain farmers adapting to climate change? And do we see a similar prevalence of increasing nitrogen rates given that kind of regulatory nutrient management planning, given that role of policy? So I was fortunate enough, along with some collaborators, including the Maryland Grain Producers Association, to get some funding from the Hughes Center to look at this question and a few other questions. Maryland grain producers were curious about farmer adaptation and perceptions of climate change as well. So it was wonderful to be able to partner with them and undertake this work, and gave us really kind of what I view as unprecedented contact to a range of farmers across the state of Maryland. So we did interviews with Maryland row crop farmers in the years of 2021 and 2022. I'm not a map person, so you'll forgive me, but I roughly tried to show where these interviews were done. We tried to group the state into quadrants. So we, interviewed 10 farmers on the mid to upper eastern shore, 10 in the lower shore, and then 10, 6 and 4 across Western Maryland, given a little bit more priority to heavier grain growing areas, but ultimately trying to get kind of the full picture of different areas across Maryland. So we did those 30 row crop interviews in total and got approximately about 1,500 acres on average for our interviewees' farms. So again, a good sample of relatively large farms in Maryland. So what did we find? Well, the vast majority of our interviewees, 83%, believe that climate change is happening. I like this quote that one of them shared with us. Drought is longer, heat is hotter. When storms come, they're heavier, they're more severe. Maryland grain farmers appear to be able to articulate in many cases, kind of what we have in terms of empirical evidence that these events are already happening, they're already changing. They're very close observers to the weather, and so they note it. Like Midwestern farmers, only a minority believe that humans cause climate change. 33%, or about a third of our sample, believe that humans have some level of causal role in climate change. The most are skeptical about that. But again, similar to Midwestern farmers, skepticism is not a barrier to adaptation. 90%, or 27 out of 30 of the farmers that we interviewed reported that they were already adapting in some way to climate impacts. The most reported practices are up here. Increasing use of no-till, shifting crop varieties, and that doesn't mean necessarily diversifying your rotation in terms of the number of cash crops. It often meant using different seed types or corn varieties. Some of this was about increasing drought tolerance. What I have here is something that farmers were talking about: short stature corn. This relatively low corn that does a little bit better job of growing in harsh weather conditions, particularly windy conditions. This was one of the more reported adaptation practices, and quite in line with some of the USDA statistics on number of acres under irrigation. We saw about a third of our samples say that they were increasing the use of irrigation as a way to deal with growing amounts of drought and inconsistent rain patterns overall. So these were the most reported adaptation practices. I do want to note, returning to that idea of quick fixes, practices that can help us withstand kind of the economic or vulnerability challenges of climate impacts, but would accelerate environmental impacts. We did see a number of those that were somewhat prevalent in the sample. Farmers were reporting a growing amount of conventional tillage. Many were not excited to be returning to this, and it wasn't seen as a regular regime change, if you will, but whenever you would get heavy rains and have to enter the field and it would get rutted up and bumpy, ultimately farmers felt like they would have to convert out of a no-till system to tillage, all just to kind of even out that field into the future. And that's completely understandable, but of course it does present some challenges in terms of potentially increasing the likelihood of sediment and nutrient loss. We also saw farmers talk about a growing amount of drainage on their land just to deal with heavy rains, be able to get those rains off the landscape and get to farming. And this is something, again, that drainage tends to, without the appropriate conservation practices, tends to accelerate nutrient loss into waterways. Now, one of the things we really didn't see, only one of the 30 interviews reported this in any way, was going into the field or preparing for rain events with additional nitrogen fertilizer application rates. This was not a common practice in Maryland whatsoever. Farmers just really didn't talk about it. And returning to this idea of policy and the role that policy played in shaping their decisions, it certainly seemed like regulatory nutrient management planning did really kind of have an impact here. It was one of the factors that farmers cited as limiting their use of additional nitrogen. And the other factor I'll say is that looking at the management practices that farmers were using in terms of nitrogen management, and farmers credited the program with this to some extent, was that nitrogen management was at a high floor. They were using a lot of conservation practices already, particularly compared to many places in the Midwest. So there is some notable policy benefits here. That said, I do want to note the policy challenges here. Certainly farmers are frustrated about this policy, and in many ways, understandably. And one of the things that was cited that was interesting to me is that while farmers were at a high floor and were not, widely adapting to climate change through adding additional nitrogen, they also weren't significantly exploring new ways to improve nitrogen management efficiency. Farmers in Maryland have done a lot, and we've seen a lot of progress in terms of nutrient use efficiency, but we know we have to go further to ultimately meet water quality goals, and particularly given climate change. And farmers ultimately weren't kind of thinking about that next step. Part of that reason may be kind of the way in which standards get put in place through regulation can create a bit of complacency. There's quite a bit of research in standards use in education, for instance, that show this, that ultimately people try to meet the standard rather than exceed it. And we had a number of farmers in somewhat of a resigned way say, we just follow the nutrient management plan, right? We're doing a good job, we're hitting the nutrient management plan, but they weren't really trying to exceed that plan. More than kind of a social psychological factor, though, other farmers talk to us, and I've heard this relatively widely, is that the nutrient management plan puts in place technical challenges to ultimately implementing, more sophisticated nutrient management planning processes and practices that would follow from them. The plan has been dramatically, the planning process, I should say, has been dramatically revised since the time of these interviews, and we'll see if that shift alleviate some of these burdens, but certainly at the time, this was actually a barrier to further improvement, at least as farmers reported it. Okay, so I just want to summarize some thinking across these studies. First of all, climate change's impact on farmer decision making is complex, right? There's no necessarily certainty in which way it's going to go, but the point I want to emphasize here is we shouldn't simply assume the status quo. Farmers are going to be adapting to climate change. It's a production risk. Things are ultimately going to change. The question is how and why. And I want to come back to this, at least in the Bay States, right? This 28% increase in nitrogen loads. It's a really interesting model, really important, but the key factor here is we don't actually know how that's going to change. because farmers are going to adapt in really important and nuanced ways. What we need to, at least from a scientific standpoint at the moment, is do a better job, in my eyes, of bringing together these kind of biophysical climate models with social science that looks at behavior change to get an estimation of how different kind of general patterns and adaptation will lead to different environmental futures given those behaviors and the environmental changes. Another point I want to make in coming out of these studies for me was that, you know, we as in social scientists studying this work, we understand that farmers face significant barriers to nutrient management challenge, behavior change, right? And there's a bunch of papers like this. I like this one because it's the most famous and has a great title, but I put this one paper up here in the top of this slide. Adoption of agricultural conservation practices in the United States, evidence from 35 years of quantitative literature, right? We've been doing this work for a long time. We have a sense of what's impacting farmer behavior. But the point I'm getting at and where I'm at in my own work is that understanding these barriers is in itself not leading to change that is significant enough to address our environmental challenges. You know, we have seen quite a bit of progress in the Bay, but we know there needs to be more work done. And in the Midwest, most of the work there that's really looking at the progress has essentially chalked it up to a challenge. And I just read a study that shows there's no significant improvements being made over the last 50 years in terms of nitrogen management and nitrogen entering the Bay there, or the Gulf, excuse me. So we know there are barriers, we understand those barriers, but that's not helping us get the job done. And climate change, as I've tried to articulate in this talk, is ultimately going to accelerate the consequences of those barriers to conservation, the consequences of our inability to solve them, because it's going to lead to increasing amounts of fertilizer loss, both from farmers' profitability and from the environmental aspect. So what I've been doing since I've come to the Nature Conservancy and been fortunate enough to work with a number of these programs and bring that research component from UMSEED as well is really trying to think about how do we move from understanding barriers to understanding how to overcome barriers. And I want to give credit where credit's due here. Agricultural economists have been thinking about this for a long time. There's a lot of really wonderful work and kind of behavioral economics that examines different ways to nudge or influence or shape policy. And that work's really interesting. What I'm trying to use at the Nature Conservancy with our really great team here is think about how do we actually kind of go beyond the experimental, the lab-based work that has been done with kind of behavioral sciences in the past and actually explore challenges and behaviors in kind of real pilot programs. So I've been borrowing from the field of implementation science, which comes out of public health. And that's the scientific study of the methods to promote the systematic uptake of research findings and other evidence-based practices into routine practice, right? So like, how do we actually get things done? How do we actually create change? And what led to that change? And we put together a program here at the Nature Conservancy that's quite interesting, where, you know, I'll share briefly kind of our approach to implementation science in agriculture, which is, you know, we're trying to get these kind of pilot intervention programs going. We always co-design those with our agricultural partners, often private sector retailers, who are trying to figure out how do we enable our customers to be successful in a difficult business, in a difficult market, while also providing environmental benefits. So we work with them, we talk with them, use their insight in many cases to design interesting potential interventions that can help farmers. We focus on achieving actual behavior change. Like, these are real programs that go out there, they sink or they swim, but they're focused on getting management practices on the ground, if you will. We're seeing real impact in the environment. And we conduct social and environmental evaluations. I'm fortunate to work with a wonderful team. We have a number of other social scientists that work with me across the Conservancy, but we have got some great soil scientists and other people with different backgrounds that really kind of help us put together the pieces of these programs to see what change did we get, why, and how significant was it in terms of environmental impact from an interdisciplinary standpoint. I know I'm at time. I won't go into these deeply, but I'll just note we've been experimenting in pilot form with a couple different types of interventions that have gone out. One's been a yield warranty that was offered to encourage farmers to try implementing biologicals into their nutrient management regimen. We're just wrapping up a study of how that went now. Then there's definitely some lessons learned. It does seem to be like potentially an effective way to encourage a certain set of practices, though there are a number of challenges associated with it. One of which being that farmers ultimately use the biologicals in ways that were prioritizing increasing yield rather than reducing nitrogen rate. So it's something for us to think about. And again, goes back to that conservation practices aren't always used in the way we're anticipating. Another program we put out there is planning vouchers. This one's been really exciting. It's really flexible. Essentially, the idea is that farmers get an option to have $1,000. It's not a ton of money, but $1,000 that goes towards helping them plan nutrient management, finding opportunities for efficiency, and they just have to work with a certified agronomist, a number of kind of, like I said, retailer partners across the state. People seem to be really excited about this. And the things that we've taken away from it is that it meets farmers where they're at because we're not dictating the practice or what to do or anything like that. So you get some of those really progressive farmers that are already pushing the limit, but you also enable farmers that maybe are new to trying to think about how do we push efficiency to the next level and don't have as much data and don't have as many practices. This works for them as well and can help them take the first step. And I'll just, end here with one of the last areas that we're looking into is performance-based payments. Given some of the challenges with monitoring and assessing the impact of conservation practices, because we're not necessarily sure how they're being used, we've explored the idea of paying farmers directly for the environmental benefits they achieved based on coming up with sort of a good metric of those impacts. And that at the moment has been centered around nitrogen use efficiency. We have yet to release one of these programs into the real world. It's taken a lot more effort and thought than I think, at least I originally imagined whenever we started it, but I'm excited about the potential, and many of our partners and farmers seem to be quite excited about this as well. Okay, so I'll summarize here and then take some questions. So, as I've said, climate change presents significant challenges to efficient nutrient management on farms, and it also accelerates the cost of our inability to achieve significant and efficiency improvements. Farmers, in my experience, deeply value the environment. Every farmer that I work with cares about it quite a bit. Ultimately, they need the enabling conditions to further improve efficiency, both to become sustainable economically, but also further sustainable from the environmental perspective. And I think we, particularly social scientists, need to do a better job of figuring out how to create those conditions. And one of the things that's it should be enabling us to do that is bolder funding programs. I really kind of think we need to see a shift in how that money is coming out. If we want to take implementation science and agriculture to the next level, so larger pots of money, longer timelines, often programs kind of come in and they come out and farmers get whiplash. So I think there needs to be longer timelines, and we need more programs that do a better job of supporting research and implementation. I often find that many of the things that are out there do one or the other, and ultimately they need to be combined. So I'll just acknowledge some funding organizations, people have provided support. Special thanks to Lindsay Thompson, Jennifer Gannon, Rachel Irvine, and Sandra Marquardt Pyatt, among many others that helped with this work. And special thanks, I should say, also to all the farmers that were willing to share their insights. I'll end with a grumpy picture of my dad at the old family farm and the kids enjoying a tractor ride, and happy to take any questions. Thank you so much.
So thank you, Matt. There are several questions in the chat, and we can either read them out or you can read them, or the person that put them in there. I think Assistant Secretary Hans Schmidt provided both a question from MDA, provided both a question and a comment. And I don't know if he is still on the call.
Can you hear me?
Would you like to
Sure.
ask your question, Hans, and also your comment?
Sure. So I was juggling a couple things, Matt, as you were talking and so forth. And as you've mentioned, in Maryland, we have our farmers are pretty forward thinking. They're putting a lot of practices on the ground, a lot of conservation work on the ground. We have regulatory nutrient management that I think is far ahead, better than any state in the country. I guess my question is when you're talking about further improvements to nutrient management, our nitrogen management, what's the next step? I mean, we're doing the 4 Rs, we're doing a lot of no-till cover crops, these practices. What's the next thing past that our farmers need to do?
Yeah, yeah. And I would couch this initially by saying that I don't want to prescribe one practice or something for every farm. Farmers ultimately need flexibility. They need to kind of adapt the practices that work for their operation. So I definitely don't want to be in a position of telling farmers what to do. But from the perspective of the study, the practices that we know can provide relatively significant environmental benefits, but weren't being widely used by our interviewee group was variable rate nitrogen application or precision farming, some people will call it, right? It's looking at your different yield zones across your field and then matching inputs to those specific yield zones. That's not to say farmers aren't doing that in Maryland. It's just a relatively limited use practice in terms of the data that we have in front of us. And farmers generally commented, and in particular related to the nutrient management planning, that doing that specific variable rate added considerably to the paperwork challenges associated with regulatory nutrient management challenge planning, and that often that was a discouraging factor from them taking that kind of next step into doing that. Now, there are other factors there. Of course, the equipment's expensive to do it, so maybe you have to custom hire to have a big enough farm to make it pay off. It's challenging often to get all of the data in place to put precision management on the farm. And certainly the payoff of it can vary based on the yield to nitrogen input ratio at the time. So I don't want to say that that's the only factor, but it was something that came up during those interviews in terms of policy.
I know a lot of our large farm operators are using some of those practices, probably not so much on the smaller scale. And as you said, those costs, go up quite substantially to put those practices on the ground. As you may or may not know, we are, looking at nutrient management from the standpoint of how do we start to implement some of this newer technology into, our reporting and making sure that farmers are getting the credit that they certainly deserve. The one comment that I did put in there, and I've seen in a number of presentations, not just yours, but in others, is that when we talk about nitrogen load to the bay and we talk about the dead zones and so forth, is that it only, when you look at the presentation, you look at the slide, it only shows Maryland. Well, Maryland's not the only state that drains into the bay. We've got 6 other states that are draining into the bay. And as I said earlier, our farmers are pretty forward thinking. A lot of them are using precision ag in their practices, the cost share, the conservation practices that were going on that other states don't have in there. So just, the messaging being is that when that, it comes across sometimes as it's our Maryland farmers aren't doing enough, but let's think of it more in the context. It's the whole watershed. And I'll just leave it at that.
No, and I'll just confirm that. I appreciate that note. I certainly agree with that perspective and would acknowledge the massive amounts of gains and progressiveness that is in Maryland. It's wonderful to be able to work with these farmers because they are certainly pushing the limits in many cases of what can be done on a farm.
Thank you. The next question is, and comment, again, you have a question, comment, combination, from Judy Gifford. And Judy, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and ask it, or if you want me to do it.
Sure, I can ask it. I mean, my comment was if you want to change people's behavior a little bit, if you want to change things a little bit, you change their behavior. You want to change things a lot, you change the way people see things. And as we know, extension started that way with, you know, going to farm visits and whatnot. And I think that it's a bigger issue than just nitrogen application rates or the 4 Rs. You know, it's the whole monoculture, soil health, building biologicals, getting back to the way the Bay was, or Maryland, or the country, with prairie grasses and things like that, that actually change the dynamics of the soil. And that's the way you're going to stop the climate change. And so it's kind of frustrating to say we'll just do input substitution changes without looking at the broader picture of the really, you know, Trey Hill planting corn into this mixed cover crop that, you know, you wouldn't think the corn would have a chance, but it does. And he's got the ability to make those mistakes. He's got the financial cushion that he can do some of that. And I think the more that we can get people out to see that and publicize these kind of farmers, back to our roots of extension, instead of trying to fix a system that inevitably is not going to succeed, because we're on a negative feedback loop spiral with the way we're taking care of our soils. And I biked around yesterday, and I saw so much dust and so much tillage. And I know Maryland is better than most, but 70% of the ground in the United States is bare in the winter. And, you know, plowing it's just, we know what we need to do. And I underappreciate the dilemma in getting people to change their behavior. And so it's just kind of like, do you go down the path of fixing a bad behavior and make it less bad? Or do you go down the path of trying to create a new system, which I know ties in with policies and the Farm Bill and everything else? But I think we're kind of in a conundrum, and there's no good answer. And I'm afraid that agriculture is going to suffer no matter what we do, because the farmers are caught between a rock and a hard place. And I don't know, maybe I'm just venting, but it's just, it's very frustrating. I went to a Understanding Ag seminar with Million Acre Challenge with Alan Williams on last week. And it was just revolution. It was just so inspirational and mind boggling to think about what can happen and what should happen versus the frustration of how to get there and the resources needed to do that. So I appreciate your work in, you know, taking away some of the barriers and trying to figure that out. But I also fear that, whew, it's just such a huge challenge. It's just so mind boggling.
I'll just very briefly say I hear you, Judy. I mean, we'll have to get a beer here soon and talk through it, because I definitely hear you. Sorry, Nancy, go ahead.
That's all right. So we have 2 remaining questions, and we have 2 minutes. So Ernie Shea, if you'd like to ask your question.
Yeah, I guess it's a question and a comment, Matt. First, thanks for this presentation. It's great. I love to see social scientists more engaged in these conversations about transformational change. So you talked about the treadmill of productivity that lots of producers are stuck on, where they're driving for more and more production, but falling farther and farther behind. So I wondered if you've had any conversations with producers about a new fundamental business model where they're not just compensated in the marketplace for the commodity that they're producing, but there is a market signal and a reward for filtering and storing water, sequestering carbon, enhancing biodiversity, the things that add societal value. And that feels to me, in my thinking, of a different way forward, where you're not putting all of your emphasis on production of a commodity and have unintended consequences, but you've got a bigger, more complex business model with multiple dimensions for reimbursement. So has ecosystem service, delivery, and markets come up in any of your work, Matt?
Yes, yeah, it has. And I need to think about, I could probably talk about this for like 10, 15 minutes. So I'm going to try to figure out a quick way to say it. I completely agree, right? Like, farmers are prioritizing for the price of a commodity that doesn't include often the environmental costs that are associated with, or the environmental benefits. Farmers get paid the same for their corn, no matter how much it emits or whatever you want to say. And that's a major challenge. It's a challenge in many industries, and, you know, agriculture and beyond. I think there is a potential to shift market signals through some of those ecosystem markets And based on my conversations with farmers, I think if those signals and the markets are done well, they'll certainly turn to them and prioritize that and have that be part of their business. As I've said, farmers are not opposed to a clean environment by any means. They just also want to keep farming and make a livelihood. Now, another thing that we did, I'll note as a caveat to that, as part of this study, was investigate farmers' perception and response to the agricultural carbon market as it stands today. And, you know, my point here being, without going into all the details, is that the ecosystem markets where they're at now are not enticing. They're not paying enough. There's too much confusion around enrollment and what's going to be counted and not counted. In Maryland, many of the farmers feel like they're sort of being negatively rewarded in those systems because many of the companies that are implementing and pay for them only want new practices, not existing practices. And so farmers are like, well, we've been planting cover crops for 20 years. You know, like we have to, you know, go out of that and start tilling and all this stuff. So I think there's a strong potential. I just think the design of those programs, of those markets, needs to change going forward to enable, in particular, Maryland farmers, but a wider segment of farmers to participate.
So we'll go to our last question. Dr. Ken Staver. Ken, are you still on? Okay, his question, Matt, is wondering where the evidence came from demonstrating at the whole field scale that precision N applications reduce N losses to the environment.
I will happily email Ken after this and share that research. I will note, you know, that it's potential, like I talked about with these other conservation practices. Ultimately, the implementation of precision nitrogen application or variable rate nitrogen application, you know, is going to impact the environmental consequences. There needs to be a net improvement of nitrogen use efficiency and rate reduction through variable rate. And in general, that can happen because we see high levels of yield instability or stable low yielding zones in many farmers' fields. So it's about better matching that. That said, if you decide to increase nitrogen application rates for some reason in those systems, it wouldn't necessarily lead to that. But research has suggested there's a strong potential for the precision management to lead to environmental gains.
Okay, if there are no other questions, we want to thank everybody for joining us today. Dr. Hauser, thank you for your presentation. We did record this, so we will send out a link to the recording. And if you're interested in the research, we will also be sending out a link to the Hughes Center's webpage, which has a research page with all of the research projects we have funded during our duration. So thank you again and hope you all have a great week.